On the night of July 22, 2015, a quiet suburban neighborhood in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, became the scene of an unthinkable tragedy. Shortly before midnight, a 13-year-old girl inside the Bever family home placed a desperate 911 call. Speaking in a whisper, she told the dispatcher that her brothers were attacking the family. The call, brief and chaotic, conveyed a sense of immediate danger. Dispatchers sent officers to the address, fearing the worst but unaware of the level of violence awaiting them. When police arrived, they encountered a house darkened and eerily silent. As they moved inside, they discovered one of the most disturbing crime scenes in the city's history. 5 members of the Bever family had been brutally stabbed to death. The victims included 52-year-old David Bever and his wife, 44-year-old April Bever. Their children, 12-year-old Daniel, 7-year-old Christopher, and 5-year-old Victoria, were also found murdered. Each had sustained multiple stab wounds, showing the ferocity of the attack. Amid the carnage, officers discovered to survivors, the 13-year-old girl who had placed the call was still alive, though gravely injured from stab wounds. She was quickly transported to a hospital for emergency treatment. In another room, officers found a 2-year-old toddler miraculously unharmed despite the violence around him. The survival of the youngest child provided the only faint sense of relief in an otherwise devastating scene. As police secured the house, they quickly determined that the attack was not the work of an outside intruder. The killers were family members themselves. Evidence pointed to the Bever brothers, 18-year-old Robert Bever and 16-year-old Michael Bever. Both were soon located and taken into custody. Neighbors, who had gathered outside as news spread, watched in disbelief as the young men were led away by officers. The revelation that the perpetrators were the victims' own sons and brothers stunned the community. Investigators began piecing together the timeline of the night. The 13-year-old sister's call had likely saved her life, alerting police quickly enough to prevent further killings. Officers later learned that the Bever brothers had intended to kill the entire family and then move on to a wider rampage. Their plan was interrupted, but not before most of the household was destroyed. News of the murders spread rapidly across Broken Arrow and beyond. Residents who had long viewed the Bever family as private but ordinary struggled to understand how such violence could erupt behind closed doors. Community members placed flowers and notes near the home, expressing grief and disbelief. In the days following, the tragedy dominated headlines, described as one of the most gruesome family massacres in Oklahoma's history. The survival of the 13-year-old girl, though marked by physical and emotional trauma, stood as a testament to resilience. The discovery of the unharmed toddler added another layer of complexity to the case, underscoring the randomness of survival amid calculated brutality. For investigators and the public alike, the Bever family massacre raised chilling questions about violence within households, the hidden dynamics of troubled siblings, and the unimaginable reality of parents and children destroyed by their own family members. The murders inside the Bever family home were not the result of a sudden outburst of rage. They were the product of deliberate, careful planning carried out over months by Robert Bever and his younger brother Michael. When investigators searched the house and examined seized electronics, they uncovered a chilling trail of preparation that revealed the extent of the brothers' intent. On computers inside the residence, detectives found search histories that left no doubt about what the teenagers had been studying. They had looked up techniques for killing silently, ensuring that victims would not be able to cry out or escape. The searches also included methods for disabling home security systems and strategies for eluding law enforcement once the murders were complete. The information showed not only foresight but a cold, methodical effort to anticipate every possible obstacle. Further evidence emerged in the form of spreadsheets. These files listed weapons, potential kill counts, and even detailed escape routes. Investigators described the documents as resembling an operations manual for mass murder. Each line reflected a calculated approach to violence, and together the files painted a picture of young men determined to transform fantasy into action. Perhaps most disturbing was a USB drive discovered among their possessions. Contained within were video diaries recorded by Robert Bever. In these clips, Robert appeared calm and composed as he discussed the murders he intended to commit. His words conveyed anticipation, even excitement, about the destruction of his family and the larger plans that would follow. Unlike a spontaneous confession of anger, the recordings reflected enjoyment in the planning itself. The brothers' inspirations also became clear. They idolized infamous mass shooters, with particular reverence for the perpetrators of the Columbine high school massacre. In their minds, the Bever family murders would serve as a launching point. They envisioned a nationwide killing spree, one that would claim at least 50 lives. Robert and Michael spoke of becoming part of criminal history, remembered not for who they were in life, but for the scale of their crimes. In addition to digital plans and diaries, investigators discovered a home surveillance system installed by the brothers. Cameras placed inside the residence captured portions of the massacre itself. The footage documented movements and interactions during the attack, preserving evidence that demonstrated not only the violence but the detachment with which it was carried out. The recordings, later reviewed by investigators, reinforced the premeditated nature of the crimes and the absence of mercy. As authorities reconstructed the planning, distinctions between the brothers' roles began to emerge. Robert, the elder at 18, was the ringleader. His writings, his videos, and his demeanor reflected control and dominance. Michael, at 16, appeared more conflicted. He participated in the preparation and the killings, but evidence suggested hesitation. In later proceedings, this distinction would become critical in assessing culpability. Yet, during the planning stages, both brothers contributed to the creation of a blueprint for destruction. What investigators ultimately revealed was not an act of sudden family conflict, but the unfolding of a long-conceived plan. Every search, every spreadsheet, Every recording pointed to the same conclusion. The Bever brothers had turned their household into the testing ground for an ambition that extended beyond Broken Arrow. The massacre was intended to be only the first chapter of a larger story they hoped to write in blood. After the murders, Robert and Michael Bever were charged as adults with 5 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of assault with intent to kill. Authorities emphasized that the brutality of the crime, combined with the brothers' ages 18 and Michael 16, required the full weight of the legal system. The decision to try Michael as an adult was controversial, but prosecutors argued the scale of the crime demanded accountability beyond juvenile jurisdiction. Inside the courtroom, Robert Bever immediately distinguished himself from his younger brother. Observers noted his demeanor as disturbingly calm. At times, he even smiled, giving the impression of detachment from the enormity of the accusations. He corrected reporters and investigators on specific details of the stabbings, treating the proceedings as though they were an opportunity to display his knowledge rather than moments of consequence. His lack of remorse became a defining feature. Beard of the trial's early stages, Michael Bever, by contrast, presented a strikingly different image. In court, he appeared visibly emotional. On several occasions, he was described as tearful, nervous, and hesitant. Later statements from Michael indicated that he had doubts about participating in the attack, but feared Robert's control. This portrayal suggested that although he took part in the killings, his role had been more conflicted, shaped by intimidation and fear, rather than a driving desire to commit violence. As the legal process advanced, Robert chose not to take his case before a jury. Instead, he entered a guilty plea. By doing so, he avoided a prolonged trial, but secured no leniency. The judge sentenced him to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The ruling ensured that Robert Bever would never again leave prison, permanently removed from society. His emotionless reaction at sentencing further reinforced the image of someone unmoved by either punishment or responsibility. Michael's path diverged. Unlike his brother, he proceeded to trial, where prosecutors laid out the evidence of his involvement. The defense sought to highlight his youth, his fear of Robert, and his claim of hesitation before the attacks. Ultimately, the jury weighed his age against the severity of his actions. The verdict was guilty, and the sentence was life imprisonment, with a possibility of parole after 38 years. This outcome reflected the court's attempt to balance accountability with recognition that Michael was a minor at the time of the crime. The contrast between the brothers' courtroom behavior became a lasting point of discussion. Robert, cold and unrepentant, seemed to embrace his role as orchestrator of the massacre, while Michael embodied a complicated mixture of culpability and fear. Together, their trials underscored the devastating consequences of the crime and the different trajectories of 2 siblings, bound by violence, but separated by attitude and outcome. The murders of the Bever family left an indelible mark on Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. Residents who had long considered the neighborhood safe and uneventful suddenly found themselves at the center of one of the most disturbing crimes in the state's history. The quiet suburban street, lined with family homes and manicured lawns, was transformed overnight into a crime scene that drew national attention. Neighbors described the Bever family as private, while some recalled polite exchanges at the mailbox, or brief conversations outside. There were no outward indications that tragedy might erupt inside the home. To many, the family blended seamlessly into suburban life. That normalcy made the violence even harder to comprehend. How could such brutality emerge from a house that, from the outside, appeared so ordinary? The physical home itself became a lasting reminder of the crime. For months, its darkened windows and empty rooms stood as silent testimony to the events of July 22nd, 2015. Eventually, community leaders and residents decided the structure could not remain. The house was demolished, clearing the lot of its painful associations. In its place, a memorial garden was created, intended as both a tribute and a space of healing. The garden honors the 5 victims, David and April Bever, along with children Daniel, Christopher, and Victoria. Pathways wind through flowers and greenery, with plaques commemorating each life lost. For residents, it offers a place to reflect, grieve, and remember. Yet even as the garden brought beauty to the space once marked by horror, it could not erase the collective memory of what had occurred. The emotional impact lingered across Broken Arrow. Parents reassured children, while schools and community groups provided counseling and support. Conversations turned to the fragility of safety, the hidden struggles within families, and the difficulty of recognizing warning signs. Some residents avoided the area altogether, unable to reconcile familiar surroundings with the knowledge of the massacre. Media coverage intensified those feelings. News vans, reporters, and cameras disrupted the quiet routine of the neighborhood, amplifying the shock. Broken Arrow, once barely mentioned outside Oklahoma, was suddenly associated with an atrocity that drew headlines across the country. For many locals, that unwanted spotlight added to the burden of grief. Still, the community sought ways to move forward. Vigils were held, candles lit, and prayers offered. The demolition of the Bever home and the creation of the memorial garden symbolized resilience and unity. They reflected the determination of Broken Arrow residents to honor the victims while refusing to let the site remain a place defined solely by violence. In the years since the memory of the murders has remained, conversations about the case resurface with each anniversary, reminding residents of the fragility of peace within seemingly ordinary settings. The garden stands as a quiet counterpoint to the violence, offering solace to those who visit and a reminder that the community has chosen remembrance over despair. The Bever murders left scars that cannot be fully healed, but the response of Broken Arrow demonstrates how communities attempt to reclaim spaces marked by tragedy. Through remembrance, reflection, and unity, they sought to preserve the dignity of the victims while acknowledging the depth of their loss. On July 16, 2011, in Port St. Lucie, Florida, 17-year-old Tyler Hadley committed an act that would shock the nation. Inside his family's suburban home, Tyler used a hammer to bludgeon his parents, Blake and Mary Jo Hadley, to death. The murders were brutal and deliberate. After the attack, he dragged their bodies into the master bedroom, covered them with items to obscure the scene, and closed the door. With his parents dead only a few feet away, Tyler turned his attention to a plan he had been preparing for weeks. That same night, Tyler hosted a massive party at the house. Between 40 and 60 teenagers arrived, filling the living room, kitchen, and backyard. Music played loudly, alcohol flowed, and marijuana circulated as if it were an ordinary gathering. Yet the reality was anything but ordinary. The bodies of Blake and Mary Jo remained in the bedroom as their son entertained his peers just outside the door. Partygoers later recalled Tyler's demeanor. Some said he appeared jittery, nervous, and on edge. Others described him as strangely giddy, almost exhilarated. Throughout the evening, he hinted at the crime. To a select few, he confided what he had done. His closest friend, Michael Mandel, was eventually shown the bodies. Despite the horrifying discovery, Mandel did not immediately alert authorities, choosing instead to leave the house and wrestle with what he had learned. By morning, the truth could no longer be contained. Police received a tip from another party, attendee who had heard Tyler's confessions. Officers arrived at the Hadley home, found the crime scene in the master bedroom, and arrested Tyler. He was taken into custody without incident. During questioning, Tyler admitted he had planned the murders well in advance. Investigators discovered evidence that he had spent weeks researching methods online, weighing different options, and fixating on the act. He had also stopped taking his prescribed antidepressants, a decision that may have lowered his inhibitions. His stated motive was chillingly simple. He did not want his parents interfering with his desire to host parties and live without restrictions. The courts treated the case with utmost severity. Tyler was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The brutality of the crime, combined with the callousness of hosting a party immediately afterward, shocked both prosecutors and the public. At trial, the details of his planning and the casual nature of the gathering weighed heavily against him. Ultimately, Tyler Hadley was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Hadley case became infamous as a symbol of reckless violence and distorted priorities. A teenager, unwilling to face boundaries at home, chose to erase Ben permanently through murder. The juxtaposition of a crowded party and the hidden reality of his parents' bodies created a narrative so unsettling that it remains etched in true crime. History. In January 2013, Albuquerque, New Mexico, was shaken by the actions of 15-year-old Nehemiah Griego. Inside the family's modest home, he began a calculated series of murders that would claim the lives of his mother, 3 younger siblings, and his father. Armed with firearms available in the house, Nehemiah carried out a plan rooted in months of dark obsession. His first victims were his mother and younger siblings. He shot them at close range, eliminating the most vulnerable members of his family. Afterward, he waited for his father, a pastor and military veteran, to return home. When his father entered, Nehemiah ambushed him with an AR-15 rifle, ending his life in an instant. By nightfall, 5 family members were dead. The killings did not mark the end of his intentions. Nehemiah had planned to continue the violence outside the home. He revealed to investigators that his goal was to proceed to a nearby Walmart and possibly a school to carry out a mass shooting. His plan was to kill randomly until police arrived and shot him. This extension of violence emphasized his fixation on infamy, echoing the mass shooters he idolized. Investigators uncovered journals where Nehemiah detailed violent fantasies. He wrote about killing, about weapons, and about the thrill he believed such acts might bring. These writings, paired with his calm confession, portrayed a teenager detached from empathy. When asked about motive, Nehemiah admitted he acted out of boredom and curiosity, wanting to know what it felt like to kill. The lack of visible remorse disturbed prosecutors and the community alike. His demeanor during questioning was chillingly calm, as though describing routine events rather than the slaughter of his family. But that composure, combined with the scale of his actions, led prosecutors to seek adult charges despite his age. The defense countered with arguments about Nehemiah's mental health. They pointed to his isolation, depression, and long-standing obsessions as signs of instability. While these factors added complexity to the case, they did not erase the calculated preparation or the devastating consequences. Ultimately, Nehemiah Griego was sentenced to multiple life terms. Because of his age, power, eligibility was set far in the future, but the sentence ensured decades behind bars for the victims, relatives, and the broader community. The punishment reflected the seriousness of the crimes and the need to protect society from future harm. The Griego case stood out not only for the brutality of the murders, but also for the insight it gave into the mind of a teenager drawn toward violence. His journals, his calm confessions, and his fixation on mass shootings provided a disturbing portrait of youth corrupted by dark fantasies. The murders, and his plans for further carnage, became a grim reminder that warning signs, when ignored or unseen, can escalate into unimaginable outcomes. On February 2nd, 1996, 14-year-old Barry Loukaitis entered Frontier Middle School in Moses Lake, Washington, armed with 2 handguns and a rifle. His destination was his afternoon algebra class. He was dressed to mimic a Wild West outlaw, wearing a long coat that concealed the weapons he carried. Inside the classroom, Barry unleashed sudden violence. He first turned his rifle on his algebra teacher, killing him in front of the stunned students. 2 classmates were shot and killed as panic erupted, while another student was seriously injured. During the chaos, Barry delivered a line drawn from the film Natural Born Killers, "This sure beats algebra." The phrase, casual and detached, reflected the disturbing influence of violent media on his actions. Barry's rampage came to an end when a physical education teacher, acting with remarkable courage, tackled him and restrained the teenager until police arrived. Without that intervention, the attack might have continued, with even more lives lost. In the aftermath, investigators examined Barry's background. They found a boy troubled by family turmoil, depression, and feelings of isolation. He had been influenced by graphic media, including films and violent imagery, which seemed to blend into his growing resentment. Accounts from peers suggested he had faced bullying, and his writings revealed suicidal thoughts mixed with violent fantasies. Trial. Barry's defense argued insanity, pointing to his mental health struggles. The prosecution countered with evidence of planning and deliberate execution. The jury convicted him of multiple counts of murder and assault. He received a sentence of life imprisonment, plus 205 years, ensuring he would never be released. In May 1998, 15-year-old Kip Kinkel committed one of the most shocking acts of youth violence in Springfield, Oregon. Born in 1982, he grew up the youngest child of Bill and Faith Kinkel, a respected couple in their community. From an early age, Kip displayed troubling interests, particularly an obsession with weapons and violent imagery. Teachers described him as intelligent but deeply withdrawn, prone to angry outbursts, and socially isolated. Signs of his inner turmoil had appeared long before the tragedy. Friends and family recalled his fascination with firearms and explosives. Eventually, Kip began hearing voices, relentless commands that urged him to kill and destroy. Though he was later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, at the time his condition went largely unnoticed. Instead, his odd behavior was dismissed as adolescent rebellion. On May 20, 1998, Kip was suspended from Thurston High School after being caught with a stolen handgun. The shame of suspension weighed heavily on him. That afternoon, in the family's suburban home, Kip retrieved a rifle and shot his father, Bill, as soon as he returned from work. Hours later, when his mother, Faith, came home, Kip greeted her with cold violence, shooting her repeatedly until she collapsed. Both parents died inside the home that had once symbolized stability. The following morning, Kip carried his rampage into the community, armed with 3 guns and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. He entered Thurston High's cafeteria filled with students. Without hesitation, he opened fire. 2 classmates were killed instantly, while more than 20 others were wounded in a matter of moments. Chaos erupted, yet remarkably, several students found the courage to tackle and subdue him, preventing further carnage until police arrived. Inside Kip's coat, investigators discovered a disturbing note. It expressed despair, profound self-hatred, and a chilling confession that he was driven by voices no one else could hear. The letter read like the mind of a boy consumed by mental illness, torn between his awareness of suffering and his inability to resist destructive impulses. The trial focused heavily on his mental state. The defense argued that Kip's schizophrenia impaired his ability to control his actions, painting him as a deeply ill teenager rather than a calculating killer. The prosecution emphasized his planning, his stockpile of weapons, and his deliberate decision to target both his parents and classmates. Facing overwhelming evidence, Kip ultimately pleaded guilty to murder and attempted murder charges. In sentencing, the court acknowledged his youth and mental illness, but also the extraordinary harm inflicted. Kip received 111 years in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would spend his life behind bars. The sentence reflected not only the deaths of his parents and classmates, but also the trauma carried by survivors and the community of Springfield. The aftermath left scars across Oregon. Purston High reopened, but the memory of violence lingered in classrooms and hallways. For many, Kip Kinkel's case became emblematic of the complex intersection of adolescent mental illness, access to firearms, and school safety. His story raised difficult questions about recognition of warning signs and the line between illness and accountability. Even decades later, the tragedy remains, a reminder of how untreated suffering can erupt into devastating violence. On October 1st, 1997, 16-year-old Luke Woodham carried out a violent attack that began inside his own home in Pearl, Mississippi. That morning, before leaving for school, Woodham murdered his mother, Mary Ann, by bludgeoning and stabbing her. Neighbors later recalled nothing unusual in the hours before. But inside the Woodham residence, his mother's life ended in silence. After the killing, Luke drove to Pearl High School, carrying a rifle and ammunition. When he entered the school grounds, he sought out his ex-girlfriend, Christina Menifee. Standing in the parking lot, he opened fire, killing Christina instantly. His bullets then struck another student, Lydia Dew, who also died, and 7 others were wounded in the chaos. Panic spread as students screamed and ran for cover. The pre-attack only ended when Assistant Principal Joel Myrick, armed with a personal handgun, confronted Luke and held him at gunpoint until law enforcement arrived. Investigators discovered that Luke had been writing extensively in a personal manifesto. His words expressed rage over bullying, rejection, and feelings of abandonment at home. He described himself as unloved and unwanted, lashing out against those he believed had humiliated him. Within those writings, Luke also admitted to the murder of his mother, claiming she had mistreated him emotionally and physically. A disturbing element emerged during questioning. Luke claimed he was influenced by a secretive teenage group calling themselves the Croth. According to him, the Croth encouraged violent fantasies and promised power through destruction. The group's existence, though never fully substantiated, revealed a troubling dynamic of peer manipulation and the vulnerability of isolated teenagers to coercion. At trial, the defense argued that Luke was a manipulated, mentally unstable teenager under the influence of stronger personalities. The prosecution countered that he was fully aware of his actions, pointing to his calculated decision to kill his mother before attacking the school. The manifesto was entered into evidence, its language highlighting both his planning and his deep resentment toward classmates and family. Ultimately, the jury convicted Luke Woodham of 2 counts of murder for the deaths of Christina Menifee and Lydia Dew, as well as 7 counts of attempted murder for the wounded students. He was also convicted for the murder of his mother. The court sentenced him to 3 life terms, plus additional decades in prison, ensuring that he would never be released. The Pearl High School shooting holds historical significance as one of the first modern school shootings in the United States, preceding the wave of similar tragedies that would follow. It forced communities, educators, and law enforcement to confront the unsettling reality that violence could erupt within schools from students themselves. The aftermath left Pearl, Mississippi, grappling with grief and questions that lingered long after the trial. How had a teenager's anger, isolation, and alleged involvement in a cult-like group escalated into such devastation? For many, the case of Luke Woodham remains both a tragedy of lost lives and a warning about the consequences of untreated despair and unchecked influence among vulnerable youth. In 1999, 12-year-old Lionel Tate was entrusted with babysitting 6-year-old Tiffany Unick in Broward County, Florida. What began as an ordinary evening turned into a tragedy that would shock the nation. Tiffany suffered catastrophic injuries while in Lionel's care. The autopsy revealed a fractured skull, a lacerated liver, and other severe internal damage. Medical examiners concluded that her wounds were consistent with the force of a fall from several stories, far beyond what could be explained as accidental. Roughhousing. Lionel claimed that he had been imitating professional wrestling moves he had seen on television. His defense argued that he never intended to cause Tiffany's death and was simply acting out childish play. Prosecutors, however, emphasized the severity of her injuries, arguing that the extent of force showed reckless disregard for her life. Despite his young age, Lionel was charged with first-degree murder in 2001. A Florida jury convicted Lionel Tate, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. At just 12 years old at the time of the crime, Tate became the youngest American ever to receive such a sentence. The decision ignited a national debate over juvenile justice. Advocates questioned whether children that young could truly comprehend the consequences of their actions, while others maintained that the brutality of Tiffany's death required accountability regardless of age. Over time, appeals were filed on Lionel's behalf. In 2004, the original life sentence was overturned on procedural grounds, and he was released under probation. Many viewed the development as a second chance for the boy who had already spent years behind bars. Yet his release did not mark an end to his legal troubles. In 2005, Lionel Tate was arrested again, this time for armed robbery. The incident violated the conditions of his probation, and the court responded with severity. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. For many, this outcome reinforced perceptions that despite the initial controversy surrounding his age, Lionel had continued down a path of crime. The case of Lionel Tate remains one of the most significant and controversial episodes in American juvenile justice. It raised questions about how society should handle children who commit violent acts, the influence of media such as professional wrestling, and whether life sentences for minors constitute justice or cruelty. Tiffany's death devastated her family and community, and her name became permanently tied to the debate over punishment and rehabilitation. Lionel's case forced courts, lawmakers, and the public to reckon with difficult questions about crime, responsibility, and youth. His later offenses only deepened the tragedy, showing how the lines between accountability and compassion remain complex when children commit horrific acts.